when we say we want reconciliation, and when Archbishop Raphael says the path to reconciliation is a very long one, so suggesting that reconciliation is a long way off, that could be understood by a lot of Indigenous Australians as essentially, we are not reconciled. In fact, it is explicitly saying, we are not reconciled. And what do you call two people who are not reconciled? What do you call them? Enemies.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to the Caldron Pool Show. Today I am joined by a second-time guest, that is Dr Stephen Chavura, who is a historian and an author and a very dear friend to us at the Caldron Pool, and I'm really excited to have you on for a second time, so thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on again, Evelyn. It's fantastic to be on the show.
Now, I really wanted to get you on because in Australia, we have some very sort of pressing matters at the moment, which I think it's really important for us to understand better and to come with a decision based on, I guess, educating ourselves with what the facts around this particular issue is. And for those who are tuning in who are not from Australia, we are about to be faced with a vote. And us countrymen over here have to make a decision whether we vote yes or no on something called the Voice. And so Dr. Stephen Chavura here, he has been incredible with this. He has been at the front lines, so to speak, speaking about this, educating people on facts, providing his opinion on this, and it's one which we value very greatly. So we wanted to have you on to discuss that. And I believe that you were recently on Sky News Australia giving this opinion, which was really good to see. Love seeing Christians on mainstream news. I think it's amazing that, and you did such a good job representing Christians, and that is all that we are here at the Caldron Pool Show. So, and you also wrote, I will add, a really good article that kind of went into length about different arguments for and against the Voice and what those were. So before we sort of get into what, what the yes or the no vote means, for those who are tuning in who might not be aware of what the Voice is, are you able to explain that to our listeners, what that means exactly?
Yeah. So the Voice to Parliament is a proposal to add to our current parliament, our current legislative or lawmaking system in Australia, a body whose existence is guaranteed by our constitution, a body that has the right to make a statement on all policy and all laws that go through our Australian Parliament that have an impact on Indigenous Australians. So this is a question of Australia's relationship to Indigenous Australians who, of course, were here on the continent of Australia prior to European arrival in 1788. And the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians is to a great extent not a happy one. There were massacres, diseases, all sorts of horrible things. Now, there are a lot of good things as well, it must be pointed out. But, it is the case that the history has at many points been very, very dark. And Indigenous Australians, a large portion of Indigenous Australians, not all, and we might come to that later, are really living lives that are not at a sort of an equal level of life outcomes to non-Indigenous Australians when it comes to things like health, income, employment, education, incarceration, and things like that. And the idea of the Voice to Parliament is this idea that we have a body that tries to make sure that the opinions of sort of Indigenous Australia are expressed directly to the Parliament whenever laws are passed or being discussed that directly impact on Indigenous Australians. So that's sort of the idea behind the Voice to Parliament, and it's going to be enshrined in the Constitution, which means our Constitution is going to be changed, which is why it's coming to Australians as a referendum, because in Australia, our Constitution can only be changed if it's brought to the whole Australian people in a referendum.
Mm. And this doesn't happen very often, does it? Changing the constitution.
No, it hasn't happened that many times in our history. And most of the times when it is put to Australians, we vote no. So it's actually quite rare for Australians to vote yes to change the constitution. Um, Australians are instinctively conservative about these kinds of things. So this is a huge deal in
Mm.
Australia. And another important thing, Evelyn, is that this is very much a moral question in Australia. It's a moral issue, which I think is why churches have had so much to say about it,
Mm.
because this is about the relationship between Australia and Indigenous Australians, at the heart of which is this concept of reconciliation, which is a Christian word. It's sort of a Bible word, if you like. And so naturally, Christian leaders, clergymen, intellectuals, and Christians, just normal Christians, are taking quite an interest in all of this. So it's a matter that almost intrinsically interests the churches. The only thing is, I'm not so sure that the churches have been offering the best guidance on this particular issue, which is why lately I've been sort of speaking out a little bit more.
Hmm. I've seen a lot of rhetoric around, churches, well, Christians should be voting yes because that's loving your neighbor. And it's interesting, when you were explaining what the voice actually is for our listeners, who might want the full background, everything that you said sounds wonderful. Like, and it does. And I think often a lot of these sorts of moral issues are always presented as being morally superior for certain reasons. But when you get, I guess, to the nitty gritties and you kind of go what it would mean practically, in a practical sense, you kind of find out that maybe it's not so moral after all. So before we sort of get into, I guess, what your opinion will be on the right decision, are you able to explain the essence? You mentioned reconciliation, but there are a lot of Christian leaders. I think it was the Anglican diocese, or I don't know, the word bishop or priest or something of Sydney, who was
You sound
on.
like a Presbyterian.
I am. I don't know a clue about these things. But he sort of came on to mainstream and basically pleaded with Sydney Anglicans to vote yes. And it was interesting because a lot of it is laced with those very biblical words, like you mentioned, reconciliation and loving your neighbor. Is that the main argument that they're sort of going for, that the Christian view is to vote yes because of that?
Yes, that is the main argument, and you're talking about Archbishop Kanishka Raphael,
Hmm.
who went on to the ABC's Q&A, which is one of
Yeah.
Australia's sort of premier debate shows for those watching overseas. And he didn't quite tell Anglicans to vote yes. He urged Anglicans to give generous consideration to voting yes. And more recently, one of Australia's top Anglican public intellectuals and theologians, Reverend Dr Michael Jensen, published a very widely read article arguing the same thing as the Archbishop, basically saying, and the essential argument is this, that voting yes to this voice to Parliament will be a significant step on the process to what they call reconciliation. And it is a profound form of loving our neighbors. I think that's actually a very misguided argument. I think it comes from a good place. I think they're making it sincerely, and they're both thoughtful men and they're very good men. But I think it's misguided for a few reasons. And just before maybe we talk about that, I just want to say, I'll just point out to those at home, particularly the Australians, I've written a very substantial article arguing why, in actual fact, Christians should vote no to the voice. And you can find it on the ABC Religion and Ethics website. It's for free. And I go into a lot more detail in that argument. And I wrote that article, Evelyn, because I know that there are a lot of clergy, a lot of church leaders in Australia who kind of don't know what to think about this. But the most of the message they're getting from their church leaders, and this is Protestant and Catholic, is basically the Christian thing to do is to vote yes, or give very serious consideration to voting yes, because it's about reconciliation, it's about neighbor love, and that kind of thing. So I guess my message is, in actual fact, I think when you take neighbor love into consideration, and when you really interrogate this concept of reconciliation, in actual fact, I think there's a much stronger case to vote no.
Well, that's what I was hoping you might be able to get into. Obviously, I've read your article and I've listened to some of your interviews, but I'd love it if you could expand on the reasons why you think the advice that a lot of the church leaders are giving is essentially the wrong advice, and why they are wrong or urging that Christians should vote yes.
Yeah. Well, in a nutshell, and I'll expand on this, the argument that this will be a significant step towards reconciliation in Australia, I find that they give very few, well, really, they give no convincing arguments that this is the case. And I actually think there are good reasons to think that if we instituted this voice, that far from leading to reconciliation, it would actually lead to a lot of division, and not just division between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, but actually division between Indigenous Australians themselves, as some tribes feel that they are being told what to do by other tribes in this voice to Parliament. For example, so one of the major arguments that I have against the voice to Parliament, but also against Archbishop Raphael and Reverend Dr. Michael Jensen and others, is that at no point do these men offer any good argument to the effect that if we brought about this voice to Parliament, it will be an effective mechanism to improve the lives of the worst off Indigenous Australians. Now, for years, we have been told in Australia that one of the reasons that we are not reconciled and that we don't have reconciliation is because of the horrible living conditions that many Indigenous Australians have to endure. Now, at this point, I should point out that we have to get out of our heads the notion that all Indigenous Australians are living in a terrible state of inequity. That is not the case. Now, the exact percentage of Indigenous Australians who are roughly living on par with non-Indigenous Australians is debatable, but it's probably around about 80%. So that's an important thing to point out, that round about 80% of people in Australia who identify as Indigenous Australians live roughly on par with non-Indigenous Australians on average, which means that there is about 20% of Indigenous Australians who are in fact doing it very hard, many of whom have gone to prison, have terrible health outcomes and things like that. And one of the points that I've made against sort of church leaders exhorting Australians to give generous consideration to voting yes is that they haven't given us any reason to think that it's actually going to help Indigenous Australians. Now, the Bible, of course, the second great command of Christ is to love our neighbors, absolutely. But loving our neighbors is not just about our motives. If you do something for someone that actually turns out to make them worse off or doesn't make them any better off, but you do it from a loving motive, I would actually say that's not really the biblical idea of loving our neighbors. I sort of think of the book of James, where James says, when you have someone poor and cold who comes to the door, don't just pat them on the back and say, be well, go, stay warm and be well fed. You actually have to do something practical for them.
Yeah.
And what church leaders need to actually argue is that there is a good reason to think that this voice will actually lift Indigenous Australians who are suffering out of poverty, that it will actually improve their health outcomes, that it will actually do something to improve school retention rates and school attendance rates, that it will actually do something to ameliorate the shocking epidemic of domestic violence in Indigenous communities and all sorts of other things. Now, neither Archbishop Raphael nor Michael Jensen offered any kind of argument to that effect. All that you tend to hear is, this is going to improve their lives. This is going to improve their lives. How do they know? Michael Jensen, in his very long argument, and his very articulate argument in favor of the voice, at no point even tries to argue that it's going to help them. He basically says, some people say it's not going to help them. Well, that's a tricky issue, but we should still vote yes. I mean, that, I'm not really being simplistic there. That's more or less what he argues. That's just not good enough, particularly when we're talking about changing the Australian Constitution. And so what the great lack of guidance from church leaders has been is just not in any way showing us how this is actually going to help Indigenous Australians. It's all very much sort of a symbolic argument. Now, the problem is, there's a fantastic book written a bit over 10 years ago called The Politics of Suffering by Peter Sutton. And for those at home, if you want to read a fantastic book just on understanding the dynamic of public policy and law and activism and Indigenous Australians, this is probably the best book that's ever been written. It's a brilliant book. And what Sutton argues, and Sutton is not left-wing, Sutton has spent his life living with Indigenous people. He's been adopted by Indigenous families. He knows several Indigenous languages. He was a fighter for Indigenous rights and land rights for decades. But what he points out is that sort of the symbolic and the rights agenda towards Indigenous Australians, it seems to have failed, in the sense that over the decades, as the emphasis on helping Indigenous Australians has been on things like native title, a national apology, more autonomy for Indigenous regions, encouraging Indigenous people to explore their own culture. What he said is that this has coincided with a decline in Indigenous living conditions. And what he basically says is that it seems like the more we pursue symbolic gestures, in actual fact, the worse Indigenous conditions get. And the point that I want to make on that is that if that is the case, then we've got to be very careful about just running into another sort of gesture, which is this voice to Parliament. Now, maybe some might argue it's not just a gesture, it actually gives real power to Indigenous Australians. Well, I would say, well, no, it gives real power to a select group of Indigenous Australians who may or may not represent the actual needs of those sort of 20% of Indigenous Australians who are genuinely suffering. The thing is, we've had something like this before. We had ATSIC, which was abolished in round about 2005 by both political parties. Why? Because it had proven to be basically ineffective in alleviating the most serious disparities and disadvantages and sufferings of Indigenous Australians. It seemed somewhat indifferent to questions like domestic violence, and it was constantly shrouded in accusations of corruption and things like that. And it just got to the point where the government just said, we've got to get rid of this. And we did. The worst thing that could have happened is actually if ATSIC had been constitutionally enshrined, you never would have gotten into, you never would have been able to get rid of the thing. And we've got to be careful about going into something like that again. And so it's all well and good for theologians and churchmen to sort of say that this is about loving our neighbor. But if you want to love your neighbor with a particular law or a particular public policy, you have to have a very good reason to think that this particular law or particular public policy is going to do something tangibly good for them, that it's going to help them. And we just don't have good reasons to think that this voice is going to do that.
Mm. It seems like a lot of things, like you mentioned, a lot of it's very symbolic. Like you said, Reconciliation Day, and we have National Sorry Day. And, I think over a long period of time, Australia has, I guess, on a political level, has really tried to make amends for things in the past. I think is it close to 40? I think it was like 30 something billion dollars a year. Is it billion or million?
No, yeah, it's right now it's sitting at about $39 billion a year.
Mm.
That's where it's sitting around about now. Nearly $40 billion a year right now being spent on the alleviation of Indigenous disadvantage. And the problem is that a lot of that money doesn't actually make it to the worst affected Indigenous Australians. A lot of it goes to prop up what people call the Aboriginal industry. That is activist groups, social service provision groups, academics even, dare I say it, who essentially make a living off activism and advocacy for Indigenous Australians, but without having all that much success. Now, some people are going to say right now, Chavura is being totally uncharitable. He's saying that these people have sort of had little success. I mean, how dishonoring of that is that to those people? Well, here's the thing though, Evelyn. One of the reasons people are saying we need the voice is because they're saying, well, nothing else has worked. But the problem there is that those activists who say we need this voice because nothing else has worked, they're condemning their own track record there. They're essentially saying that most everything they have done, most everything they have suggested has not worked. And so it raises the question, then why should we listen to you this time? Why would we listen to a whole Aboriginal industry, to a whole Indigenous industry that says nothing has worked thus far, therefore you should do this? It just takes away the credibility of the very suggestion itself. And so there just seem to be very few good arguments in favor of this voice. And now this sort of question of reconciliation, as you said, Evelyn, I mean, it seems every year the debates around Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations get ever more acrimonious, to the point where we had Black Lives Matter protests in our major cities in Australia because of an event that happened overseas. We are still told every year around Australia Day, no pride in genocide. We are still reminded all the time that Australia has a black history. Of course, there's a double entendre there. Obviously it has an Indigenous history, but the other meaning that it has a very terrible history. We are still being told that, we're on stolen land. We're still being told to pay the rent. Every Australia Day, people are saying that this date should be changed or that the day should be abolished. It doesn't seem, from a lot of the rhetoric of activists, that there is any more sort of reconciliation. And I think part of the problem is that it's almost impossible to define exactly what it would look like if we were reconciled. Like, what would it look like for Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians to be reconciled? What do we even mean by reconciliation? And this is a point I make in the article, that the Christian concept of reconciliation tends to be between two individuals. Or in the case of the Old Testament, sort of the nation of Israel and God. But the nation of Israel is conceived, notwithstanding the different tribes, as a sort of single entity. And sort of we understand what it means for two individuals to be reconciled. Something bad has happened between them in the past, but they both get to a point where they are prepared to put that behind them, and usually one of them repents and the other one forgives, and there is a reconciliation. And from that moment on, the great crime no longer animates their relationship. The perfect example is that very moving passage in the book of Genesis where Jacob meets his brother Esau again for the first time in years. And Jacob is afraid that Esau is going to kill him because Jacob knows he's been a real ratbag to his brother.
Yeah.
And, you know, and Jacob and Esau, they sort of see one another from afar. And but what happens is a beautiful thing. You know, Esau embraces him, calls him his brother. It's one of the most beautiful passages in the Old Testament. Yeah. You know, that is, we understand that kind of reconciliation. But my question, and this is my question to Archbishop Raphael, it's my question to the Reverend Dr. Michael Jensen. How do you apply a model of reconciliation to Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, neither of which are kind of any sort of unified group with a single voice? Indigenous Australians themselves have many beliefs about the voice. Many are most definitely in favor of it. Maybe most of them are in favor of it. It wouldn't surprise me if most of them are in favor of it. Let's even just assume that the overwhelming majority are in favor of it. Still, not all of them are in favor of it. And those who are in favor of it will very likely have a different opinion on what it should look like as well. But so Indigenous Australians themselves don't all agree on what the voice is, but very importantly, Indigenous Australians, the non-Indigenous Australians, we often think of them as sort of this single entity. They are not. They consider themselves tribes or even nations. They are not a single entity. There is no such thing as a unified Indigenous Australia. And they don't always get along tribally. I mean, even to this day, there are very, very fierce tribal disputes. In fact, even Stan Grant wrote a piece in the ABC where he was reflecting on attitudes towards the voice among his own tribe. And he quotes, and this is something you can find on the ABC website, he quotes who he calls one old uncle, who says, about this voice, I don't like the idea of one tribe making a decision for my tribe. We are a tribal people. Tribes make decisions for themselves. There should be nobody other than that tribe making its own decisions. And so you've got that on the one side, and then you've got on the other side, you've got non-Indigenous Australians who are a mixture of different races, different cultures, different ideological religious beliefs. We are not really unified in any way either. And so when we talk about reconciliation between these two groups, what exactly does that look like? It's a very, very difficult question to answer. And the problem with that is because it's such a vague, nebulous concept, it kind of means that we can go years and years and years saying that we're not reconciled because we don't even really have any definition for what that would look like. And it really doesn't matter what you put in place, what you do to advance the well-being of Indigenous Australians. The discourse of non-reconciliation will just continue. And I think because in actual fact, the notion of reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, when you really drill down into it, it actually makes very little sense. And I think it's time for churches and Christians and Australia as a whole, really, to stop leaning so much on this concept of reconciliation. I actually think it's doing a lot more harm than good. I think we should replace it maybe with fellowship, that we want fellowship with Indigenous Australians. Because when we say we want reconciliation, and when Archbishop Raphael says the path to reconciliation is a very long one, so suggesting that reconciliation is a long way off, that could be understood by a lot of Indigenous Australians as essentially, we are not reconciled. In fact, it is explicitly saying, we are not reconciled. And what do you call two people who are not reconciled? What do you call them? Enemies.
Enemies, yeah.
You call them enemies. Exactly, at war. And that is a terrible message to be putting out to Indigenous Australians, that we are not reconciled, therefore we are at enmity or we are at war. A lot of Indigenous Australians are going to imbibe that. They're going to internalize that. And that is really going to affect their relationship with non-Indigenous Australians and with non-Indigenous Australian culture, which we can get back to a little bit later. But I think we need to stop leaning on this concept of reconciliation. I actually think it's counterproductive. And I think the very notion of reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australia, when you really analyze it, is bordering on meaningless. And so any argument to the effect that instituting this constitutional voice is somehow going to facilitate reconciliation, to my mind, is just a really bad argument. It's not something to hook an argument for. Reconciliation is not a concept to hook an argument for the voice to Parliament on. If I may just say one other thing on this topic, Evelyn.
Yeah.
Many would say, well, of course we're not reconciled because look at the living disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The first thing I would say is, again, I would point out that most Indigenous Australians live roughly on parity with non-Indigenous Australians. There's a fantastic book that's just come out by Gary Johns. It's called The Burden of Culture. It is meticulously researched. And he basically argues that it's probably around about 80% of Indigenous Australians who are basically living roughly on parity or doing pretty okay compared to non-Indigenous Australians, and it's 20% who are doing really badly. And so some people will say, well, we're not reconciled. The way we know that we're not reconciled is because look at the poverty that many Indigenous Australians face, the domestic abuse, the substance addiction, lack of education, lack of employment, incarceration rates. Obviously, we are not reconciled. Well, first, that only suggests that those experiencing those negative outcomes are the ones who are not reconciled. And so the implication of that is that maybe around about the 80% who are doing pretty well, that they are reconciled. But implicit in that argument, Evelyn, is the notion that if we bring about the voice as an agent of reconciliation, then it will somehow work greatly towards solving these disparities and therefore bringing reconciliation. But again, if you're going to make that argument, you have to explain very clearly how and why the voice is very likely to be a mechanism for that kind of change. Those arguments do not exist. They are just not out there. How is the voice going to solve the problem of alcoholism in Indigenous communities? Right now, for example, 40% of Indigenous households are single-parent households. That was from a 2012 study. A 2017 study found that 44% of carers for children in Indigenous communities said that they themselves grew up in a household without a father. Now, I haven't heard anyone advocating for a voice explaining in any way how bringing about this voice is going to alleviate this problem. These arguments are just not there. And for something as for a constitutional change like this, church leaders need to be far more realistic. They need to offer Australians more than just nice Christian words like neighbor love and reconciliation. They need to offer us even more than just, we really, really hope that this will work out well. That is just not enough. So I think that what I would like to see is a greater reflection by Australian theologians and church leaders on why they think this voice to Parliament will go a significant way to helping Indigenous Australians.
I think one of the most difficult positions for Christians to be in is how the entire argument is presented. And it's similar to the same-sex marriage debate that we had in 2017, I believe it was, the entire notion for that yes or no vote was based around the assumption that love is love. So if you vote no, you are against love. And it's similarly to the climate argument. They've pinned up this as somewhat of a, if you go against it, well, you must hate the environment. Well, no, it's actually more complex. There's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more to it. And similarly with the voice, it's because it's pinned so much around reconciliation and love. It's almost, if you vote no, you feel like, well,
Yes.
I must hate the Indigenous Australians. I don't want reconciliation with the Australian Indigenous people. And it's just, it's very clever marketing, because it does somehow hit people's conscience in a way, and they think, and I feel like a lot of churches, a lot of church leaders and Christians fall into that trap where they feel, oh, well, if I vote no, that's publicly declaring that I don't want reconciliation and I don't want to give them a voice, when that's, like you said, completely not the reason. I'm sure there are some horrible people out there who do not love their neighbor and who would be voting for other things, but I can, guarantee you that most Christians, if they truly love the Lord, do want to obey his commands and do want to love their neighbors. That's certainly how I feel. So, but like you mentioned, what is loving? What would be the loving thing to do? And sometimes the loving thing to do might be having to do something that the world perceives as not loving, but really it is. And so I guess, what I would like to know, because like you mentioned there, a lot of people are saying, look, I don't know if it's going to work, but let's just do it anyway, because it's not going to hurt anyone. It's not going to hurt us. Like the Indigenous Voice, they aren't going to be creating the laws. So who cares? We should just vote for it anyway. And I'd like to ask you, what would you say to people who have that particular argument? Because I'd like to hear from you how you think a yes vote will actually harm Australians. And I'd love, if you don't mind getting into a practical sense, what this could potentially mean for our constitution, for laws, and why just voting yes because, is probably a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very common argument now for voting yes, and the argument is essentially this: everything else has failed, therefore we should just give this a try. My problem with that argument, I've got a few problems. First, the basic premise: we've tried everything else and it's failed. That is absolutely false. We haven't tried everything. We've tried some things in some places, but for example, there are many communities in which alcohol bans have not been tried because there are many people in those communities who either believe that such bans are racist, or there are moneyed interests in these communities who profit off alcoholism. Other things, trying to enforce or bring about better ways to ensure school attendance. These have not really been tried all that hard. Other things that haven't been tried because they're kind of taboo right now, and this is a major one, basically trying to get Indigenous Australians out of the regional, out of the rural areas, sort of, off country, if you like, and get them into places where there are jobs. There has been sort of no great coordinated attempt to do this. So there are lots of things that either have not been tried at all or have been tried here and there, and very often with success. So, for example, alcohol bans, they correlate very strongly with declines in domestic violence and declines in people presenting themselves to hospital with head wounds. But they're very, very controversial. And there are other things that we're doing right now, which actually could have quite a pernicious effect. So the Indigenous placement policy is basically loath to take Indigenous children out of really bad homes and place them in good homes that happen to be non-Indigenous, because they say this is sort of a form of sort of robbing them of their culture, and it's a kind of stolen generations thing again. But the problem there is that you could have a child who's in a situation in which they are taken out of one Indigenous home and placed in another Indigenous home which might have problems as well, or they're placed with an Indigenous family member in another home, and that Indigenous family member has a kinship obligation to the actual parents of that home to sort of offer the child back and or allow visitation and things like that. So there are things that we have not tried, but the other problem with that argument is that it just assumes, oh, it's the government that has to fix all of this, and everything the government's tried has failed, therefore we need this voice to Parliament. That itself is a big problem because it takes all responsibility out of Indigenous communities themselves, trying to sort out their own problems. And I'm not here suggesting that they are not trying to do that. I'm not suggesting that one bit. But that argument, we've tried everything else, therefore we have to do this, it just kind of assumes that this can only be fixed by the government. But that is absolutely untrue. And as Peter Sutton and as Indigenous Australians like Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price and Anthony Dillon, as they say, Indigenous Australians themselves have to look at themselves. They have to look at their own culture and see what they need to change about how they think, about how they live. What aspects of Indigenous culture might impede closing the gap? Peter Sutton talks about that brilliant. And that is not victim blaming. That is just acknowledging that there are all sorts of parts in all sorts of cultures that might not be conducive to living the best life. Let me put it this way. If European culture can be bagged out for having all sorts of horrible aspects to it, can we entertain the possibility that Indigenous cultures might have some also less than optimal ways of thinking and doing things? One example would be demand sharing between families. So if one Indigenous family has a house, demand sharing leads often to the case where you have relatives basically just coming and living there, whether there is room or not. And that can put children at risk. It can put women at risk. And it could also mean an Indigenous person saves up, buys a car, and because of demand sharing, an uncle can just come along and take that car and take it away for months or just take it indefinitely. That is a part of sort of traditional Indigenous culture. And who is going to save up to buy a car knowing that their uncle or any other relative can just come and take it? It sort of kills aspiration. Another aspect of Indigenous culture, which is very unhelpful, is basically the culture of silence in terms of sort of not reporting other family members to the police who may have done something horrible because of, again, sort of kinship obligations. And so, that is something that sort of needs to be addressed. So it's the notion that only the government can fix this is very, very problematic. The other thing is just at a basic level to say everything else has failed, therefore we should try this. That is not a strong argument to change the Constitution. That is not a strong argument. It's kind of like on that episode of Yes Minister, when someone says, well, we've got to do something. This is something, so let's do it. I mean, that is bad logic for public policy. And so we've tried everything and it's failed, therefore let's try this. That is a really bad argument. And again, I would just point out that those who make that argument are implicitly admitting that the people who have been paid to resolve these Indigenous problems have failed, that all the policies and laws hitherto have failed. So why then would we listen to these same people when they say this is going to work? If they knew what was going to work, why wouldn't they have done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? It's just a really poor argument. Now, in terms of the practical outcomes of this, look, I'll talk about two things. And let me just say one more thing. Some people might say, oh, let's just give it a try. If it works, that's incredible. If it doesn't work, okay, no big deal. Wrong. If the voice to Parliament fails to alleviate the suffering of Indigenous Australians, it is not just that it has failed. It is also the cynicism, the demoralization that will come about through its failure. And that is something that everyone needs to pay very careful attention to, because we have been, activists are building this thing up as though it's the answer. They are saying that everything's failed, therefore, this is going to work. This is the big answer. Can you think of the disappointment and the cynicism and the anger that will possess many Indigenous communities when these promises are not met, because they never had any foundation to begin with? So just trying this to give it a go is an incredibly irresponsible thing to do, because if it does fail, then that is actually going to leave a lot of Indigenous Australians even worse off, because as well as their bad living conditions, they're just going to have even more demoralization and even more cynicism,
division as well,
about the system. That is exactly right. Now, constitutionally, what could this lead to? What could this lead to legislatively, politically? Well, there's a sense in which, Evelyn, we don't know. That's the problem. We've been given very little detail into exactly what this is going to look like. Now, people like Professor Marsha Langdon say, oh, no, that's not true. We've got hundreds of pages of documents that sort of outline, all the possibilities. Well, it's true. There are hundreds of pages of documents. That's a pretty incredible thing. You really expect the average Australian with children and with full-time jobs and with carers' responsibilities to then go and read hundreds of pages of documents on a website to make this. And it's just a ridiculous approach to changing the Constitution. I remind all the listeners at home that when Australians were asked to vote on the Constitution in 1900, which created our nation, they were actually given a copy of that full Constitution. Politicians had literally been working on it and hammering it out for 10 years. And they were handed the Constitution and said, this is what you are voting for. We are not talking about anything as comprehensive as a new Constitution. And we aren't even given the exact details on exactly what we're going to be voting for. They basically are just saying to us, look, vote for it and the politicians will decide exactly what it's going to look for. Well, you know something, that is just not good enough. That is not good enough. And now I could see, for example, there being serious disruptions to the parliamentary process in the case that if it is the case that this voice to Parliament has a right to comment on all legislation that directly affects Indigenous Australians, well, that basically means that they're going to have the right to comment on all legislation, period. Because Indigenous Australians are citizens of Australia, are they not?
We're all Australian.
Of course they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all legislation, no matter what it is, has an impact on Australian citizens.
And if we say otherwise, then we're actually racist ourselves. Like, if you look at that, I think it's puts us in a position where it's like we're going to segregate, and that's totally what we should be against.
Oh, I agree with that, and I think actually what this voice to Parliament will do in the short run, and it'll be solidified over the long run, is it will encourage this us and them mentality, and that is something that's really bad, because the more we lean into an us and them, the less sympathy non-Indigenous Australians are going to have with Indigenous Australians. Because right now, the dialogue is that, we're all Australian, we're all one. But if this path of differentiation continues, then Australians will will start to just see them as another people, as just another nation. And, why should they care all that much about them? So it is actually a really bad thing for Indigenous Australians to go down a path that leads us to think of them in terms of a them. That is not a good thing. But let's think about a policy that sort of goes through federal parliament. I mean, federal parliament discusses all sorts of policy now. So it does discuss education policy. Does education policy affect Indigenous Australians? Of course it does. Federal parliament now discusses things like health. Does health policy affect Indigenous Australians? Of course it does. Federal parliament, of course, debates how much funding should be spent on different things. Well, does the amount of funding spent on various things, which means that that funding is not going to be spent on Indigenous Australians, does that affect Indigenous? Of course it does. It's actually really hard to think of anything that wouldn't affect Indigenous Australians. And consequently, what that means is if they have a right, if this body has a right to comment on all legislation before all legislation is passed, the question then is, how long does legislation have to wait to be passed? Is it possible that the Voice could delay and delay and delay legislation until it's come up with its comment? And so there's the possibility that legislation could be delayed and it could make Parliament even more inefficient than what it really is. And other people have also raised questions about the relationship between this Voice Department and the executive, because in the wording of the proposal that Australians are supposed to vote on, the Voice to Parliament has the right to comment to the executive. And now the executive is actually potentially be quite broadly defined to include the public service. So that would literally mean that the public service might have to suspend its operations until the Voice to Parliament has said something to it on a particular policy. And that's something that could wind up in the High Court. And even those in favour of the Voice to Parliament, so Greg Craven, for example, Professor of Law Greg Craven, has said it is a terrible thing that they've put the word executive in the wording of the referendum, because that raises all sorts of legal problems. But you know something, Evelyn, I think the main problem, and this is something that's not being discussed enough, but the main problem with the Voice to Parliament is that we know for a fact that they are going to, that the Voice to Parliament is ultimately going to start agitating and demanding a treaty. Now, how do we know this? I mean, Michael Jensen, in his long defense of the Voice to Parliament, assured the readers that at no point that there is no connection. There's no reason to think that a Voice to Parliament includes, will lead to a treaty or is a step towards a treaty. Well, with all due respect, Michael Jensen, that is simply untrue. And it is explicitly stated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart that part of the agenda of all of this is a treaty. And Australians have to understand this, that the Voice is merely one part of an agenda that involves three things: voice, truth-telling, treaty. Anthony Albanese, just a couple of years ago, said he wants to bring about a voice and he wants this to lead to a treaty. You'll find the reference to that in my ABC article. But the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is the inspiration for the Voice, says very clearly, Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda. It goes on to say, we seek a Makarrata commission to supervise a process of agreement making. Now, some of you are thinking, what on earth does Makarrata mean? Well, Makarrata is an Indigenous word, and strictly speaking, historically, it literally means spearing someone through the side, through the thigh, as an act of either vengeance or justice for some wrongdoing. Other experts have defined it as ritualized revenge. But Makarrata is actually defined. The Uluru Statement from the Heart website is actually incredibly helpful because it clearly defines what it means by Makarrata. And you can just go to the website and find out. And here's what it means by Makarrata. Makarrata is another word for treaty with a capital T here, or agreement making. It is the culmination of our agenda. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart that advocates for this voice is also saying that this is but a step to a treaty. Now, what do they mean by a treaty? What does this mean? Well, again, the Uluru Statement from the Heart website is very helpful. It actually tells us, and it says that there is a potential. I'm looking at another page here. There it is. It says there is a potential for two sovereignties to coexist, in which both Western and Indigenous values and identities are protected and given voice in policies and laws. Evelyn, when we talk about sovereignty, we are talking about countries. We are talking about political entities that do not have to, that are not under the laws of external political entities. That is what we mean by sovereignty. And so when the Uluru Statement from the Heart says, we want to, the Voice will institute a Makarrata commission, and Makarrata means treaty, and treaty means sovereignty. What the Uluru Statement is saying is that what this Voice is going to try to accomplish is a sovereign Aboriginal country, a sovereign Aboriginal state, or a sovereign Aboriginal region in Australia. It is a radical proposal of racial separatism. Like, Australians cannot be naive about this. And so when we are thinking about what we're voting for the Voice, don't just think that, oh, I'm voting for Indigenous Australians to be able to have an opinion on policy that affects them. That's the very naive, surface, superficial understanding of what is going on. Ultimately, what they are voting for is a constitutionally guaranteed body that has told us that it is going to pursue unfinished business, and that unfinished business is a treaty between Australia and non-Indigenous Australia, which establishes Indigenous sovereignty. That is what you are voting for if you vote for the Voice. And this is why, Evelyn, the argument that voting for the Voice will be a vote in favour of reconciliation is so misguided. A separate Indigenous sovereign state is not reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. It's creating a kind of legalized sort of racial separation between the two of them. Australians back in 1999 rejected including a reference to Indigenous Australians in the preamble. We said no. That was controversial enough. Now we're talking about the possibility of a treaty between Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia. Can you imagine, Evelyn, how controversial that's going to be? I mean, it's controversial enough, the suggestion that we should change the date of Australia Day. Like, that just blows up every year. Can you imagine how controversial and divisive it's going to be when the Voice starts demanding the very thing that it has told us it is going to demand, Indigenous sovereignty? That is going to be the most divisive thing that has faced Australia since the Vietnam War. No, you know something? It'll be the most divisive thing that has faced Australia since the conscription debates during World War I. That is something that has the potential to create so much anger and hatred in this country. And Christian leaders are saying, oh, no, vote for the Voice because it's going to lead to reconciliation. I think we've got very good reason to think it's going to lead to the exact opposite of that, politically, potentially legally, and socially. And so we need to go into this with our eyes open. This is a radical proposal. It is a radical proposal. Now, some people are going to say, oh, don't worry, because although they want a treaty, they're never going to get it. Well, let's think about that for a second. Let's think about that. So what we're saying is we're going to constitutionally guarantee a body that is going to demand something that it's never going to get. Does that sound like a recipe for reconciliation?
No.
Does that sound like a recipe for... It doesn't. It's a recipe for division. It's a recipe for frustration. It's a recipe for anger. It's a recipe for cynicism. It is not a recipe for reconciliation at all. And as long as this Voice, and as long as the Uluru Statement from the Heart, again, which church leaders have fallen over themselves to endorse, goodness knows why, because in actual fact, it's a very irresponsible document which tells Indigenous Australians that they are currently powerless and that the only way that they're going to have control over their destinies is with this Voice and with a treaty. What a horrific thing to tell Indigenous Australians. Because think about this, Evelyn. If you tell them that this is their only hope to have any kind of agency over their own lives and over their futures, and then it fails at the referendum, what have they just learned? They've just learned that everything is hopeless. And Christians have been falling over themselves to endorse this document. They should never have endorsed this document. It's a very irresponsible document. And let me be blunt, Evelyn, I have no doubt that this referendum is going to fail. And then I think that a lot of Christian leaders and theologians need to really think hard about their contribution to the inevitable disappointment and sense of hopelessness among those who took this document seriously. And so the notion that this voice is going to bring about reconciliation is totally naive and I think very ill-informed. It's going to lead to a perpetual call for a treaty that Australians will not agree to, and that will just be perpetual grievance and anger. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that sovereignty was achieved. Do we think that that is going to lead to sort of peace and harmony? Of course not, because then you're going to have all sorts of disputes over who gets what territory. You're going to have all sorts of disputes over what happens to non-Indigenous Australians who are living on the land that has now been given to Indigenous Australians. Will non-Indigenous Australians be able to enter this sovereign territory? Maybe we will, but maybe we'll need a passport. I mean, maybe we'll need some kind of documentation that allows us in. Okay, well, will it be the same in reverse? Will those who live on this sovereign territory, will they in turn need documentation to come into non-Indigenous Australia? Now, if the answer to that is no, then do you think that's going to bring about reconciliation? Non-Indigenous Australians knowing that Indigenous Australians can come into their territory whenever they like, but they're not allowed into Indigenous territory without the right papers. Do you think that's going to bring about reconciliation? Just going to bring about division and resentment. Now, if the answer is yes, that, okay, fine then, Indigenous Australians, they need papers to come into non-Indigenous Australia. Well, guess what we've just established? Apartheid. Now we're saying that Indigenous Australia, that you can come into it, mainstream Australia, if you're Indigenous, only if you have a particular, the whole thing is just, the problem is, Evelyn, a lot of church leaders have not really thought deeply about this. They've gone for the feels and they haven't explored the reals, if I can quote Zuby.
Yeah.
It's just a really bad way to go about public policy. And I challenge them all. I challenge them. Think more realistically, think more deeply about this, and just make sure that it is not the case that in voting yes, that it turns out to be a situation in which, you know, when some Indigenous Australians are asking for a loaf of bread, you're actually handing them a stone or a snake. And I actually think that that's precisely what's going to happen.
It is quite worrying, the trajectory that it could lead to. I think that the last few years, if anything, has showed us on display that many church leaders don't think with discernment and do not have discerning eyes and do not really have, either they're apathetic and they don't really care, or they're willfully ignorant. I'm not sure what it is, but the last few years was incredibly disappointing in the spiritual blindness that is in our church leaders. I think this is just another one of those things where they're incapable of looking ahead, or they don't want to. I'm not sure which one it is out of those. But
yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it is very difficult to be a church leader, and let me say, I mean, over the last 3 years, I would like to think I was probably relatively understanding of the position that church leaders and ministers find themselves in. And I think I was probably a lot softer on them than a lot of other people. And maybe that's because I'm a son of the manse. My late father was a minister, and I saw what it is like to be a minister over a congregation. You know, so I have a bit of empathy for ministers and church leaders, because there are a lot of bullies in congregations. There are a lot of bullies in churches where if you say something that they do not like, they will make your life miserable. They will try to destroy you. They will try to destroy your career. They will try to destroy your reputation. And so I can understand why, for example, during COVID, a lot of ministers basically went along with the protocols They were in a very, very difficult position. The ones I have less understanding with are those who just wholeheartedly were in favor of it, who were
Mm,
wholeheartedly in favor of the mandates, wholeheartedly in favor of the vaccine passports to church,
mm,
wholeheartedly in favor and uncritically in favor of the lockdowns. They're the ones I have less sympathy for.
yes.
But church leaders always have been, always will be in very tricky positions. So I do actually have quite a bit of understanding for them. But again, on this issue, and this issue is no different, I have to say.
Mm,
I would like, look, my exhortation to church leaders is, please, if you are opposed to this voice to Parliament, I can understand why you would not want publicly to say so. I actually get that. Um, but if you're the kind who often posts about debates on social media, then can I at least ask you to do this? Rather than just completely ignoring the voice to Parliament debate, can I encourage you to model uh, a sort of debate on your social media and post arguments for and against? Don't just post arguments for, but please post arguments for and against, because this is actually a really important national issue. And I think churches should actually be leading the way on what a gracious but also sort of analytically rigorous debate should be. And
mm.
churches have a fantastic legacy of actually doing this, and we should be doing it now. And that's why I sincerely encourage anyone watching this to track down my article on the ABC Religion and website, and maybe, and the Caldron Pool have shared it a bit, and they might even attach it to this video, I'm not too sure,
Yeah, we
and
will.
pass it to your minister, or if you're a minister, to read it. And read it with an open mind, read it critically. I don't mind being, taken apart. I don't mind being critiqued. That is fine. But really take its arguments into account, and maybe just start publicly raising questions about
Mm,
how likely it is that this is going to bring about reconciliation, how likely it is that this is actually going to alleviate the suffering of the worst off Indigenous Australians. Just gently raise those questions. That's all I really ask you to do.
mm.
I'd love to see that.
I do think it's great, and I commend you for your graciousness towards these leaders. You obviously can empathize because you grew up in a man, so I guess you would understand better
Yeah.
than most the difficulties. With all authority that is delegated from God comes huge responsibility, and it would be
Yeah.
incredibly difficult. You can see through Paul working his way through the churches in the New Testament just how difficult it can be to navigate and wade through all of the issues and all of the different types of people and all of the opinions. So I completely understand that it would be challenging. I think that it's the absence of objectivity and debate that is the language of the oppressor. And unfortunately, we see too often these days people being silenced for just simply raising questions. And like you said, this is no small thing that Australians are being presented with. And if there is any time for courage and for openness with discourse and discussion, it would be now around this. So I think that's a great suggestion to talk about, the pros and cons, and to have that flowing through our Christian leaders and Christians as well, because all of us will get a vote. So it's important that we understand. And like we said before, you would have to be a sociopath to not want to love your neighbour. No one here is suggesting to not love the Indigenous Australians and want the best for them. I certainly do. I worked many years in an Indigenous community in the police. I saw firsthand how bad it can be. I'm a big believer in personal responsibility as well, but I do also agree that there are certainly things that could be done to help vulnerable people in certain communities around our country, and I would love to see that. Like you, I tend to obviously think that this is not the answer to those questions and those problems. And I do hope that there is a discussion that can be had. I think if you look throughout history with these issues, they don't seem to lead to reconciliation in the past. You know, the whole Australia Day debate has always been change the date, and now it's moved from change the date to abolish the date. You can see how it escalates, and I feel, like you said, it's not just giving them a voice, it will lead to other things like it has in the past. And I would certainly rather reconciliation with my brothers and sisters from wherever they are around the country, as opposed to division and segregation. But before we finish off, is there any last words or anything you would like to say to people before we wrap it up? I will include all the links. I will include your article and your interviews on Sky as well, so people can watch that, and I guess if they have questions, they can interact with you online as well. But any last words for us, Stephen?
Really, really, again, just for church leaders to think very carefully about this, because again, if this is passed and church leaders have been promoting it and it is passed and it just leads to more division, and we find that after 5 years, the outcomes for Indigenous Australians are no better, and we find that we're now embroiled nationally in a very acrimonious debate over a treaty. Do you really want to be one of the people who supported this so quickly? This could go really bad. It is not just a case of let's give it a try. What's the worst that can happen? Nothing changes. That's wrong. If it fails, that is going to be taken as a huge message to Indigenous Australians that it is hopeless, that they are licensed to just be cynical about the whole system. And you don't want the church's image on that. So let's just be very, very careful about how we approach this issue. And it is not too late for those who have been very much in favor of it to start just being a little bit more restrained about it, and starting to gently, if you like, just start asking questions. Okay, it is a very, very important thing. We don't want to rush into it. Thank you so much for your time, Evelyn.
No, thanks for coming on. It's always such a privilege to hear your opinion on things. You are incredibly wise and well-versed, and I've always greatly appreciated your commentary on politics and religion and all of those sort of cultural issues as well. So it's been an honor, and I really hope that our listeners or viewers have gotten a lot out of this. I certainly have, just sitting here talking to you. You brought some things to my attention that I hadn't thought of before, and certainly have struck my heart and got me thinking about things on a little bit more of a deeper level, which I think we need to with this. So really grateful again. I'll be sure to include all the links in the bio of this video, and please like and subscribe and share so that we can get the message out as much as possible. Thanks again, Steve.